Sounds True presents Already Free. Buddhism meets psychotherapy on the path of liberation with psychotherapist, author, and teacher Bruce Tift.
Hello, my name is Bruce Tift, and I'd like to welcome you to this series of discussions on the dialogue between a Buddhist view and a psychotherapy view about how we might free ourselves of unnecessary suffering and experience a freedom that is already present in our lives. I really enjoyed talking about this material, and I hope it's useful for you. Perhaps you could ask yourselves if you want to be free. If so, I think that suggests that we don't already experience feeling free. Why would we not already feel free unless there were some obstacle, some problem? So when we're talking about liberation, we're usually implying that there's some experience of imprisonment, something we want to resolve or remove in order to experience freedom. And that's a major theme of our discussion in these programs, is what in fact might be the nature of any obstacle. What is the cause, the source of feeling imprisoned in our lives? Is our immediate experiencing actually problematic? And if so, is it because of our life circumstances, because of unresolved issues from our history? Or perhaps it may arise from how we relate to our experience. The first view is basically that of Western psychotherapy, that there are actual difficulties in how we experience our lives, how we organize our experience, and our goal is basically to improve our sense of self, improve how we relate skillfully to our life circumstances, so that we can feel more free, more satisfied, more engaged. And those circumstances, of course, are, in therapy, mostly inner circumstances. The historic conditioning that we still have to deal with, our life experiences that have affected us. There's this continual display of experiencing that all of us must deal with. We have no choice. It's endless. It's not perhaps resolvable. But the therapy view is pretty much that we want to improve this display. We want to improve our sense of self, our skill in engaging with our life. A Buddhist view is more that how we relate to whatever we're experiencing, whether positive or negative, is even more important than what we're experiencing. Obviously, it's very important for most of us, whether we're healthy or sick, whether we're in poverty or have adequate money, whether we have to deal with depression or have a sense of well-being. But a Buddhist view is that how we relate to all of these experiences is actually more impactful on our state of mind. In my personal life and as a therapist, I've found that both views are very helpful, very important. I often find that some people have a tendency to appreciate therapy and be cautious about a spiritual path. Some people are very invested in spiritual path and somewhat cynical about therapy. My experience is that both are very valuable, but in ways that can never really be integrated into one view or resolved into a certain formula. And it's this very lack of resolution that I find most interesting to work with. The ideas, the views, the practices that we'll be discussing in these sessions all arise from my personal work and my personal experience. I remember when I was quite young that it became clear to me that it wasn't going to be too helpful for me to just take on other people's ideas. That even though I might feel doubt about certain ideas or approaches that I was exploring, that it just felt obviously the right way to go, to base my work, my life, my practices on what personally had made sense, what was personally useful. When I was in my 20s, I began a clinical psychology program, and after 1 year stopped. Actually, I almost ran out screaming. I was horrified at what felt like an attitude that anyone training to become a doctor in psychology was by definition saying anybody in the client chair was by definition neurotic or worse. I left the country, spent a couple of years abroad, and met the Tibetan community in exile in India and became very interested in Tibetan Buddhism. When I returned, I met my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, and eventually found a way back into my interest in therapy through my practice and understanding of Buddhism. So my passion for the last 30-some years has been to find a way to use what is most skillful and useful about therapy, along with what is most skillful and useful in Buddhism, and to find a way to bring these two together because they're both so powerful and they both really focus on a certain range of phenomena. Neither addresses everything. So in these series of discussions, my hope is to have a dialogue between these two approaches and to talk a bit about how I have used both views as an ongoing dialogue between the two, an ongoing interaction that will never be resolved, but I find very rich and to be, I believe, very useful for many of the people that I've worked with. The basic view of Western therapy is, of course, very congruent with our Western culture. Our Western culture has an idea that a better quality of life comes from improving one's sense of self and one's life circumstances. There's obviously a lot that's very accurate about that. Better health, adequate money, political freedoms, learning to feel positive about oneself. Those are all wonderful qualities. And in our culture, we associate many of those positive experiences with a state of freedom. One of the possible problems, of course, is that when we place our experience of freedom in external circumstances and even inner states of mind, which we don't really have full control over, there's always a certain tentative quality to our experience of freedom. A Buddhist view approaches the experience of freedom with the assertion that it's how we relate to our experience, whatever it is, whether we like it or don't like it, whether we feel depressed or happy, whether we're in good health or poor health. Those are all very important, of course, but how we relate to our experience turns out to be even more important. And the experience of freedom arises from a willingness to be completely committed to our life, whatever it is, at any moment. So many of us, of course, want to be free. We want to feel whole. We want to feel at peace. In what way is our experience of freedom dependent on our life circumstances, our states of mind? In what way is our experience of freedom arising from our unconditional commitment to the truth of our experience? In these discussions, we'll go back and forth between these two views. Both have their value, both have their limitations. We're going to be going through 7 sessions in this program. The first will be an overview of the core Western metaphor of the developmental view. The idea that what we have experienced as young children growing up has been profoundly impactful in terms of our strategies for engaging with our life, for taking the best care of ourselves possible. The next session will be on the fruitional view, which is arising from the Buddhist idea that anything that we're going to find as far as our own basic nature has to be present in this immediate moment. If it's our basic nature, it's not something we're going to find in the future. And so a lot of Buddhist practices are deconstructive. They're about how to go deeper and deeper into immediacy and find out what is most true, actually. The next session will be an exploration about the dialogue, the back and forth nature of working from a developmental view and a fruitional view in clinical work. The next session is focused on anxiety and struggle. And I find that our experience of anxiety is right at the heart of most of the ways in which we generate unnecessary suffering for ourselves and for others. And so for me, it's incredibly helpful to start to be curious about our immediate experience of anxiety and how we might work with this very disturbing experience. That's actually just part of being human. Our anxiety turns out not to be a problem, it's just very difficult to work with. The next discussion is on body awareness, and as I said, I find the practice of staying in our immediate embodied experience central to our capacity to not get too fascinated and captured by all of our ideas and formulas about how to live our life. Most of us tend to take our ideas as actually being descriptions of reality, but I don't think that's actually accurate, and it's usually not helpful. So just as there might be a dialogue between a developmental view and a Buddhist view, also I think it's very helpful to have an ongoing dialogue between our thinking about our experience and our immediate embodied experiencing. The last two sessions will be on relationships. As I said, I find relationship so provocative, so rich, that it's extremely difficult to pretend that we have our lives together when we're in an intimate relationship. It's a lot easier to feel that we're on top of things, we're in control in some way, if we're off on a meditation retreat or at work. But when we're at home and the kids are yelling and we're worrying about money and our partner's not who we want them to be, that's where we really get to test our practice and see if our practice is actually helping us keep our hearts open. So in each of these discussions, I'll do my best to continually refer back to how we might address these central human concerns from the point of view that our basic nature is already that of freedom. And we'll discuss some of the reasons why we may not consciously be participating in this experience, and some of the ways which we might use to invite this experience into our awareness. My hope is that these discussions will be useful, provocative, and practical, whether you happen to be a clinician working with clients, whether you're someone who's interested in Buddhism, interested in therapy, interested in the dialogue between the two. And so, of course, I hope that you continually check out the ideas and see if they are, in fact, relevant to your experience and useful. The first discussion will be to explore the developmental view, which is central to Western psychotherapy's approach to how to relieve unnecessary suffering. It's based on the idea that the experiences we have as children, mostly in our families of origin, are profoundly impactful in our strategies to survive, first of all, and to have the best quality of life possible. Because these responses that we make, these formulas or strategies we come up with, are usually very intelligent, very appropriate, they tend to become habitual and to persist because they work. Because these strategies are often in response to very disturbing, difficult, even dangerous realities, they're usually associated with quite a bit of anxiety. And so these strategies usually operate out of awareness once established. An important understanding, in my experience, is to clarify that the developmental view is not actually about the past. It sounds that way, but it's really about how most of us, in a variety of ways, are living as if the present were the past, as if we were still young children in our families of origin. And this is especially true in the realm of relationships. It's as if we were acting a role in a play, but we got a lot of good response from it. It works. And we've done it so long now, we've done it for decades, that we've even forgotten that we're playing a role. We've forgotten that we're in a drama, that we actually have a larger sense of self, a larger life. So my understanding of the developmental view is that basically we're working with ourselves and others to understand how we are continuing to live in the present moment as if we were still in the past. If that's what's happening, I believe it's happening for most of us, certainly myself included, then of course it makes sense to do a good job of this drama that we're in rather than a bad job. And Western psychotherapy has a variety of techniques, theories, approaches that help somebody improve the story that they're telling about themselves, the drama that they play. The potential problem, of course, is that as we focus on the past to clarify our formulas for engaging in the present, it's very easy to assume that we're actually talking about the past. And so, of course, many people try to rework their past. You can't rework your past, of course. Any of our memories about the past are speculative, incomplete, partial, and even more potentially problematic if we somehow believe that the past is causing the present. Then we've positioned ourselves subtly as powerless victims, because we can't actually, of course, change the past. When I'm working with clients, I am always curious about their history. I want to know something about their family of origin experience, siblings, life experiences. But personally, I don't really worry if somebody doesn't want to go into their past, which many clients don't, because it doesn't really matter. We're always talking about how we are engaging in our present moment. And the present moment, in my experience, is the only moment in which we can effectively intervene. It's the only moment that we're actually experiencing our life. So in this discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about the metaphor of metabolism, which might help explain how we end up with an experience of being divided against our own selves, and the sense of dilemma that comes from that. I'm going to talk a bit about the nature of neurosis, about our claim of being problematic people, about the nature of change, give some examples of specific types of ways of working from this view, and also talk a little bit about a progression of work in which we can gradually dissolve our fantasy of being divided against our own self. The metaphor of metabolism, of course, comes from the idea of eating food for our energy, our growth. We have to eat. And when we eat, we have to be able to make use of what we eat, or it's not going to help us survive, grow, have energy. So metabolism has to do with our capacity to digest what we eat, and we're always eating our experience. Aldous Huxley has a quote, "Experience is not what happens to you, but what you do with what happens to you." It's how we process experience that seems to be most important as far as being able to make use of our experience. As infants, young children, even in the womb, we rely on our parents to digest our experience for us. Metaphorically, again, it's almost like a mother bird that would digest the worm and then spit it back up for the babies. Our parents have to digest experience, the realities of life for the young infant. It's too much otherwise. Just like a parent would not give a 1-month-old solid food. It's not that solid food is a problem. It's just that the baby can't digest it. So the parents need to buffer the child from too much intensity, to interpret experience, to hold literally, figuratively that child, protect them, to help them feel unconditionally loved, safe. All of these external ego functions provide the child with an adequate sense of safety and well-being, feeling loved, feeling they have a place in the world. Of course, all parents, I'm a parent, we're all limited. We do our best for our children, but it's always limited, and all children will have to deal with some experience that is just too much, cannot be digested, cannot be processed because of our incapacity, our immaturity as little beings. If it's not too much, then we handle it quite adequately. Some therapists would call that an adequate holding environment. And when we are held by our life, by our parents, by our world adequately, we actually can rest in being a mystery to ourselves. Every moment we can show up not having to know who we are or how we're going to handle the next moment. That, of course, is an ideal experience out of which to grow, because every moment is fresh, everything is an experiment. But for most of us, it's just a matter of degree to which we have to come up with our own formulas to protect, process, defend against overwhelming experiences of grief, fear, rage, panic, physical discomfort, abandonment, just the experiences of being a young human. One of the fundamental ways in which we protect ourselves as young infants, as young children, is to do our best to not have to consciously participate in what is most terrifying or overwhelming. The developmental view is that we make a variety of efforts growing up, and by the ages of 4, 5, 6 years old, we are finally capable of the achievement of what's called a neurotic level of organization, which really means that we're able to stabilize our repressive capacities. We're able to somewhat, in an ongoing way, push out of our awareness feelings that are just too disturbing to handle, to digest, to make use of. For example, in my family, I was eldest and a male, of course, with parents who valued independence and were somewhat phobic around the energy of dependency. So my best understanding and my current style suggests that it was very smart for me to learn to not feel dependent. If I felt dependent, I would act dependent. If I acted dependent, bad things would happen. I would be pushed away, perhaps, or love would be withheld, or my parents would get anxious, or whatever. I can't remember the specifics, so it's somewhat speculative, but I think it's pretty clear that for me it was very healthy and functional to learn to not feel like a dependent person. That allowed me to receive approval, love, to fit into our family, and, of course, it had its own benefits out in the world. The price tag, however, was that I had to find a way to never feel dependent. Anytime I felt dependent, that would be associated with a type of survival level panic. In my experience with working with people, I find that almost all of us turn out to have an annihilatory level of panic associated with our core vulnerabilities. Because as children, I think, our actual emotional survival often was at stake, and sometimes even our physical safety. So, we're a young child. We actually have somehow figured out how to not feel overwhelmed by intense feelings we don't know how to handle and our environment is not handling for us. What an incredible achievement. That's not pathological. It's very healthy. It's very appropriate. It's wonderful to be able to have that capacity. It allows us then to go out into the world, which coincidentally is when most of us go out into the world as far as school about that age, because we're able to act in sort of a stabilized, socially approved way, most of us. However, there's a price tag, of course, that is part of this achievement. The price tag is that we have managed to push out of our awareness a very disturbing part of who we are that we don't know how to handle. But pushing that part of ourself out of awareness does not, of course, make it go away. So, for example, if someone grows up, as I did, learning to not feel dependent, it doesn't mean that as a little child I wasn't dependent. Of course, I was incredibly dependent, and I had a very strong motivation to never be aware of feeling dependent. So there's a price tag, meaning that to the extent that this strategy worked, became sort of structural, was put into unconsciousness, and then persisted into adulthood, on a relative level, of course, I would have difficulty dealing with being a dependent person. And as we'll talk about in our discussion of relationships, it's very, very common that we will mysteriously end up with partners who manifest exactly what we have disowned in ourselves, and vice versa. But there's a deeper price tag that I'm especially interested in working with as a therapist, which is that we end up feeling divided against ourselves. We feel there's a part of ourself that is problematic and even dangerous, perhaps shameful or embarrassing or unworthy of love from others. So we have achieved this amazing capacity to fit into our emotional world, our unique family system, our culture, gender, so forth. But there's a very big price tag to pay, which is that we end up feeling that somehow there's something wrong with me, something that's a problem about who I am, and I have to never go there, never have a relationship with that part of me, that part of my experiencing. If we imagine being a little child standing out in the world and feeling threatened, we might put up a wall for protection, or even put ourselves in a little box for protection. That helps, but then of course the next impulse will be to claim that we want to feel connected with everything, with life. We don't want to feel alienated and disconnected from life. But we don't understand at that moment that we're the ones choosing to, for very good reasons, put the wall there. It's not happening to us. So the very success of our efforts to protect ourselves lead to inevitably an experience of being divided against oneself and, on an external level, alienated from life, not trustful of life. Because, of course, life can make us feel those feelings at any moment. So something that I find all the time in my work that I think there's not enough discussion about or awareness of is that we all seem, as adults, to want to resolve our neuroses, resolve our limitations, but we don't understand that we have an incredible investment in maintaining them, in maintaining our young survival strategies, because they were put into place for our own survival and well-being and protection. And it's not until we actually can investigate in a very immediate, embodied way whether these protective strategies are still required. Until we can do that work, we're going to constantly look for evidence that proves that our survival strategies are still required, necessary, and justified. Most of us are not aware of this sort of paradox, that as adults, consciously, we genuinely want to relieve ourselves of the suffering, the price tag that these patterns carry with them. But at an even deeper level, most of us are even more invested in making sure that we never have to give up these survival strategies. And if we ever start to, there's panic there. So, for example, to use my style, as an adult, it would be to my benefit to look for evidence that dependency was weak or sort of not very desirable. I would see how people would get victimized if they were weak. I would look for evidence that weakness was a bad thing. I would have a style of giving and not receiving, because to receive you have to acknowledge dependency, that you have needs, you want something. Whereas to give, you can give from an attitude of not having needs yourself. I would have a tendency to place myself in life circumstances that required that I be strong, take risks, be competent, self-sufficient. All of that would be evidence that would prove every day, over and over and over again, see, that's the right way to be. It's necessary. There's no question here. Personally, it wasn't until my 40s that it started to occur to me that I was an incredibly dependent person, which was quite a shock. But, of course, once I got over once I became used to the panic associated with feeling dependent, there was an incredible relief and a relaxation that came. So, in a therapeutic session, a lot of times there's this exact same process where somebody claims that